little introduction into our speakers. We have Jeff Sparrow, who is a journalist and author of the new book, Crimes Against Nature, which you can buy from the Bookmarks bookstore at the back of the room. And also we have Camila Royle, who is a Central Committee member of the Socialist Worker Party. After they do their brilliant talk, we will go to a discussion for about 30 minutes, and then so you can have your say from the floor, and then I'll bring Camila and Jeff back for about 7 minutes each. So I'm going to go to Jeff now for about 15 minutes, and yeah, just get the meeting started. So yeah.
I'm struggling to hear you a little bit, but should I start talking now? Okay, cool. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak at your conference, even in this somewhat disconcerting virtual format. I can simultaneously see the back of all of your heads, even as I watch myself speak to you from the front. So it's very Black Mirror-ish, but we shall persevere. So this book that I've written was produced to tackle one of the problems that anyone concerned about the climate catastrophe immediately confronts, namely the whole thing is so damn depressing. And I think in part that's to do with how the problem gets framed. That is that there's a common sense understanding of environmentalism which defines nature in opposition to humanity. So on the one side, there's the wilderness, understood as the world without us. And then on the other side, there's humanity. And the job of conservationists is to protect the former from the latter. Now, you know, in everyday affairs, or if you're involved in a campaign, say, trying to protect old growth forests from a developer, that kind of common sense opposition between nature and humanity sort of works, I guess. But at a deeper level, it renders the environmental project deeply depressing as innately impossible. That is, if what we're trying to do is protect places unaffected by people from the human race, well, we've already lost. The whole point of the Anthropocene concept, after all, is that humanity now affects the entire planet, that there's no place entirely devoid from our influence. Furthermore, if you see a simple opposition between nature and humanity, then you're presenting people as innately problematic in a way that pushes in a very right-wing direction. And the most obvious manifestation of that is the argument you come up against again and again, that there are simply too many people in the world, and, you know, in fact, we'd be better off if there were fewer people, which is an argument increasingly connected with very right-wing tendencies indeed, such as eco-fascism, which maybe we can touch on in the discussion. Anyway, in the very brief time I have tonight, what I want to do is address some of these issues from an Australian perspective, because in this country, arguments about wilderness are particularly problematic since they helped legitimate the dispossession of Indigenous people. That is, the British justified colonisation on the basis that the Australian continent was a wilderness. It was terra nullius, or empty land. And of course, that wasn't true. Indigenous people have been living here for at least 60,000 years. So if you're an environmentalist in Australia and you talk about protecting wilderness, well, you are reinscribing categories that are fundamentally racist. In any case, as soon as you think about it, it doesn't make sense to present a simple opposition between humanity and nature. On the one hand, humans are part of nature. We need air, water, food, just like any other creature. That's why we're affected by climate change. On the other hand, we also always and everywhere change nature just as it changes us. As a species, we survive by altering the natural world when we cook food, make shelter, create clothes, and so on. And the name we give to that process where we alter the world is labour. That is, it's through labour that we interact with the world around us. And that has been happening ever since the human species emerged, which is why the concept of wilderness is so problematic. The landscape all over the world, including places that people think of as quintessentially wild, have been shaped by human labour for thousands of years. For instance, we now know that the aspects of the Australian continent most admired by the British explorers, particularly the great open plains that they saw, had been shaped by thousands of years of Indigenous labour, particularly fire stick farming, but also other methods. So prior to 1788, Indigenous people sustained themselves from the land, the original means of production. In a society without the commodity form, they rarely produced for exchange. Instead, people related to the earth in Marxist terms as their own inorganic body, using it to satisfy their direct needs. The human relationship with the land and the sea and the air was direct and unmediated, as integral to people's existence as their own arms and legs. Now, it's important to be clear, Indigenous people did not live in some kind of utopia. There's a tradition of kind of noble primitivism, which has its own logic of racism. Nevertheless, through 60,000 years of experience, they developed an extensive knowledge about the ecosystems in which they lived, and that knowledge had been codified into songs, stories, rituals, and taboo, integrating metaphysics and morality to regulate day-to-day behaviour, ensure that communities nourished the environments on which they depended and which depended upon them. Without the external compulsion exerted by markets or masters, they could control their labour through their culture, and as a result, they could improve rather than diminish the natural environment. And this is actually quite profound, because what Indigenous Australia shows is that environmental destruction isn't inevitable, that it's actually possible for human beings to live for tens of thousands of years in ways that don't destroy nature, but in fact contribute to ecological abundance. That's not a fantasy, it's something that actually happened, and it happened over immense periods of time. So what changed? Well, in Australia, everything changed in 1788 when white settlement brought extraordinarily rapid environmental deterioration. In Port Phillip in Victoria, where I'm speaking from, it took only 4 years before the land around the colony was so depleted it could no longer support the Indigenous people who had previously lived there in plenitude. And if you read the accounts of settlers, they describe topsoil blowing away in great clouds. And this devastation did not result from so-called overpopulation. In fact, the killings and the disease accompanying settlement substantially decreased the number of people living on the land. As late as 1850, the total population of Australia was still 25% smaller than it had been in 1788. Nor was the problem one of technology. Actually, if you think about the nature of European settlement, it was conducted through sailing ships and horses and buggies and picks and shovels, a technology that today we would regard as fundamentally green. The issue wasn't technology, it wasn't population, it was that with white settlement, a production previously dependent on a knowledge of specific environments and conducted by people deeply enmeshed in the natural rhythms of seasonality became determined by the cycles of the market, where Indigenous production for use could be directed and controlled through culture and law. Capitalist production for exchange needed always to expand, with the natural limits of a particular ecology serving only as the goad for the further accumulation of values. So had the white settlers been interested in satisfying human needs, they might have learned from Indigenous people about native plants and animals and the environment. But rather than food and clothing, the Europeans were producing commodities, specifically the cattle and sheep that the market required. The hooves of their livestock destroyed the plains carefully tended by Aboriginal people. Fences and private property rendered fire stick burning impossible. They desecrated sacred sites associated with animal breeding and feeding grounds, not merely out of ignorance, but because the land mattered to them only insofar as it contributed to capital growth. And as I said, the name for the interaction between humanity and nature is labour. European settlement in Australia fundamentally changed what labour meant. The work on the land was now performed after 1788 by wage labourers, people who sold their ability to labour to capitalists and then did as they were instructed for the duration of their employment. Now, you and I take that for granted as just the way that the world works, but in the early interactions between Indigenous people and Europeans, you can get a sense of how bizarre and destructive wage labour seemed to those who weren't accustomed to it. The Aboriginal people of Australia again and again expressed their horror at European work practices. Victorian Justice of the Peace wrote in 1849, "They do not court, they being Indigenous people, a life of labour. That of our shepherds and hut keepers, our splitters or bullock drivers, appears to them one of unmeaning toil, and they would be by no means consent to exchange their free unhoused condition for the monotonous drudgery of such a dreary existence." Now, the key word here is unmeaning. The wage labourer toiled for money, with the activities she performed and the land on which she performed them a distinctly secondary matter. And that behaviour was unimaginable to Indigenous people who moved through a world saturated with meaning, a land where everyday tasks linked men, women, plants, animals and spirits, so there was no action without consequence. Capitalism, however, replaced those organic connections with the cold nexus of the wages system. By definition, the commodification of labour power mandates a distinction between work, during which employees do as their bosses command, and leisure, the time that belongs to us. Prior to 1788, these categories had not applied to Indigenous people. Because they controlled their own labour, that is, their interaction with nature, their daily activities belonged to an integrated whole, one in which the improvement of the natural world was a key human value. Now, compare that to our experience and you can see the problem. And the way I like to put it is to ask people to think about the two Amazons. The first Amazon is the company, which now employs 1.3 million people. It's the second biggest employer in America. The people who work in Amazon are monitored by various high-tech devices that tell them when to pick an item, when to carry it, when to pack it, and punishes them if they're a few seconds slow. They have no control of their own labour, even as that labour continues to change the natural world in incredibly destructive ways. In 2018, Amazon emitted 44 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, greater than the whole of Switzerland. So Amazon, the company, continues to expand. Amazon, the jungle, continues to shrink at record rates. And those two things are connected. The juxtaposition gives you capitalism in a nutshell. So how did we end up here? Well, the Australian example is actually really, really interesting because from very early on, the settlers obsessed about how best to turn Aboriginal people into what Governor Gipps called voluntary labourers for wages. He argued that Indigenous people were by nature wild and they needed to be induced to submit to the restraints which are opposed to ordinary labourers. And again, you can find the colonists using this rhetoric over and over again. And what's so fascinating about it is the attitude to Aboriginal people closely echoed the rhetoric of industrialists back in England, who also decried the reluctance of ordinary people in the early phases of capitalism to behave as voluntary labourers for wages. The same tropes about nature applied. One late 18th century factory owner in Edinburgh put it, getting the locals to work for wages was like putting a deer in the plough. In Europe too, ordinary people were seen as by nature indolent, improvident and self-indulgent. And basically identical strategies were used in both countries to break people from their traditional beliefs and to normalise wage labour. How much time do I have? Not very much, do I?
You have 2 minutes.
No, I can't hear you anyway, so I'll just plough on. Okay. So this identical strategies were used in both countries. In Australia, there's been a big focus on the abuse of Indigenous children. The reason why Indigenous children were targeted is because the Europeans thought because they were younger, they were easier to break into wage labour. If you look at the early phases of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, you see the same thing. The philosopher John Locke famously argues that children should begin work at 3. Daniel Defoe kindly suggested they could wait until they were 4 or 5. And the parallels with what was done to Indigenous people was no accident. In Australia, as in Europe, the establishment of wage labour rested fundamentally on breaking the relationship people had with the land, so they had no choice but to sell their ability to labour to capitalists. In fact, there's a direct connection between the two. The dispossession of Indigenous society in Australia began with a penal colony that was founded, at least in part, to discipline the people dispossessed in Britain, after the traditional commons became private land owned by agricultural capitalists. Okay, now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to suggest that it's possible or even desirable to rebuild the society that existed in Australia in 1788, any more than it's possible or desirable to rebuild feudal Europe. We have to look forward, not back. Nevertheless, the fact that it's possible for human beings to live in an ecologically sustainable way is of some significance, because by comparison to the deep time of Indigenous culture, capitalism, a uniquely destructive system, is a mere historical blip. And if anything, the technological developments fostered by capitalism should make ecological management easier, not harder. That is, prior to 1788, Indigenous people improved the natural world using culture and custom. We are now in a position where we can use science and technology. We can be far more conscious and deliberate about what we do. There is no reason why we can't control our labour collectively and democratically, deciding what we produce and how. No reason other than the logic of the capitalist system. And as soon as you put it like that, the entire debate suddenly starts to look far more optimistic. The problem isn't people. The problem is the system to which people are subjected. And I will leave it there.
He's gone. So we're going to go to Camilla now for 15 minutes. So I'm just going to give the mic to Camilla.
Hey, thanks. And thanks to Jeff. And his book is excellent. So I urge you all to get a copy and I recommend it to people. It really explains these quite complex ideas in, as you can see, very accessible, easy to understand kind of manner. So to start with the situation we're in, I think, we do have an urgent climate crisis and an ecological crisis. The most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has made clear how big the scale of the challenge is and how quickly time is running out. So one of the authors said it's now or never. If you want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that figure they always talk about, without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, it will be impossible. They're talking about emissions having to peak at 2025 in a few years and start to decline if we want to do this. And of course we can see the effects of the climate and ecological breakdown already. Just one of the series of disasters that we've seen over the past 3 years has been the heat waves in India and Pakistan. Earlier this year, temperatures reaching the high 40s, maybe even 50 degrees. Heat waves that affected 1 billion people. It's a very scary situation. It makes me scared and worried about what's happening. It's also clearly a social justice issue, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, throughout the weekend. It's the poorest who are the most at risk when you have things like heat waves, including people living close together in big cities, people where there's not much outdoor space, the elderly, very young, and people who work in industries like construction, in factories, and so on. The heat in South Asia is also affecting the wheat harvest at a time when supplies are already stretched, partly due to the invasion of Ukraine as well. We also have the catastrophe for biodiversity, which other people have written about in our journal International Socialism and elsewhere, related to climate change, but not just about climate change, also about related to overfishing, habitat loss, diseases that affect wildlife, and all symptoms of the violent and toxic capitalist system that we live in. Jeff's absolutely right to talk about how it's not people in general that are causing the problem, it's the system. It's already explained very well, I think, how this kind of Marxist approach can help us understand and make sense of what's happening to the planet. The way we need to understand ourselves as having, what Marx called a metabolic relationship with the natural world. Like all species, humans transform the world around us, but unlike perhaps other species, we do it in a conscious and deliberate way, and we do it, as we've said, through our labour, through our collective labour. But further than that, you also get what some Marxists have called a metabolic rift, where as you've gone from a situation where people have control over the way they relate to the natural world to a system where they sell their labour to the capitalist for a wage, and you get alienation of workers, but you also get a rift in that relationship with the natural world. So what's destructive to workers and what causes alienation for us also at the same time leads to this kind of metabolic rift. Marx put it quite well, I think, when he said that all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. There's a common struggle, really. Workers struggle against capitalism and its endless drive to accumulate. There's also a struggle against the destruction of the natural environment. I wanted to talk a bit more about one aspect of that, how we can use that kind of Marxist understanding of metabolic rift. And I think it's related to the whole question of pandemic diseases, which is something that was very familiar to Marx and Engels when they were writing back in the 19th century. You read Engels on the condition of the working class in England, for example. He talks a lot, and in his other works, about all the different kind of infectious diseases that they faced at the time. Cholera being the one that absolutely terrified people in the working class in 19th century London, and also terrified the middle class as well, because they started to get worried, didn't they, when they thought that the cholera pandemic might actually spread to them and affect the more well-off elements of society. At the start of this century, we were told, weren't we, that infectious diseases like that were something of the past, that new diseases that would affect people would be kind of more degenerative diseases like heart disease and cancer and those kind of things. How wrong that they were, really. We've seen the re-emergence and continuation of old infectious diseases like things like tuberculosis, Ebola we have now, malaria and cholera, polio. There's even a suggestion that there might be polio in the water in East London now. These are still with us, and we've seen the emergence of new diseases that we haven't seen before. Mainstream, I think, ecologists were a bit surprised by all of this, but actually some Marxist writers did actually recognise the threat of new pandemic diseases. Not that Marxism means you can predict everything that's going to happen in the world. We're not omniscient, but I mean, people applying a kind of Marxist approach did predict some of this stuff. Rob Wallace wrote a book called Big Farms Mean Big Flu. Richard Levin's late Marxist ecologist wrote a great article that you can read online called Is Capitalism a Disease? Mike Davis, who is sadly very ill at the moment, terminally ill, wrote a quite terrifying book about avian flu called The Monster at the Door. 15 years before the COVID pandemic. There's another one called The Monster Enters as well that you can get at Bookmarks. I think what they were understanding was that when you have major changes in social relations, you get the emergence of new diseases. Related to the way that we use land and the changing way that we relate to nature. Once you change the way you relate to nature, it also changes epidemiology and gives the opportunity for new sources of infection. Capitalist agriculture made us all vulnerable to disease pandemics. And that's just one aspect of the way that capitalism has transformed our relationship with the natural world. It has created the conditions for previously isolated viruses to emerge in animal populations and spill over into humans and then spread amongst humans as well. This is largely accepted that this is what COVID has done. Coronaviruses are very, very common in bats. Once you have exposure to bats, then they can potentially spread over into the human population. In the 20th century, we've had an industrial model of agriculture that began in the US in the post-war era and has spread internationally, where US farmers were encouraged to grow huge amounts of grain in these monocultures to produce very cheap inputs for processed foods, and were hugely subsidised in order to do that. We've changed what we eat and how we eat and the way animals are reared. Animals are kept together in an industrial model of agriculture in huge flocks, where they're very, very similar in terms of their genetic diversity and often stressed because of the conditions that they live in. All of this creates the conditions for infectious diseases to spread. They're located near to human populations, of course. Agriculture expanding in some parts of the world, for example, the expansion of palm oil plantations in parts of Southeast Asia has meant that peasant agriculture has been pushed into the margins, further into the forest, where people are more likely to come into contact with infectious diseases carried by things like bats. So, and the other element to it as well is that I think many scientists had a poor understanding of how class differences made some people more vulnerable to pandemic diseases than others. Richard Levins describes in his article how, actually when it comes to any kind of disease, the poorest people are the most vulnerable to it, as we're all kind of aware of at the moment, I think. He even says that as a predictor of coronary disease, it's better to measure class position than to measure cholesterol if you want to figure out who is going to get a coronary a heart disease and die from it. In the final few minutes, I just wanted to raise another issue related to climate change and social justice, leading on from social justice and pandemics. And I think we'll talk about this throughout the weekend. But I think that, also we should mention the issue of migration and refugees, because arguments for resolving the climate crisis are also arguments for open borders. And carbon dioxide does not respect borders between countries. And, we can't keep people within borders when they're moving due to the effects of climate change. It's a complex issue. It's very hard to tell how many people are going to be migrating around the world due to climate change. The most widely cited study talks about 200 million people by 2050 every year. It's a huge amount. Really just an estimate. We don't really know. What we do know is that already people are moving due to natural disasters, and that these are definitely becoming more common as we start to see climate change already taking effect. And it's going to lead to more horrors. Like the deaths of those 50 people in the truck in San Antonio this week, people who were probably trying to migrate from South America to the north, dying in extreme conditions of extreme heat as well. I think we should be a bit careful about saying that, when the temperature gets hotter, it's always going to lead to conflict. Often people look at places like the Middle East and North Africa and kind of treat it as if, conflict is just waiting to break out there, that there's, somehow more violent in that part of the world or something. We should reject this kind of idea. But we do know that people move due to climate change. And there are also, I think we mentioned it a bit already, but there are eco-fascist thinkers who will respond to climate change by arguing that there's too many people, and that there's too many of the wrong sort of people, and also that we need to stop people from crossing borders if we want to fix our relationship with nature. The suspected perpetrator of the Buffalo shooting in New York earlier this year, a guy who killed 10 black people in a supermarket car park, produced this long manifesto where he talked about eco-fascism, described himself that way. These are people who think that, contrary to what we've been talking about today, that, if only we got rid of some of the people coming into the US or into Australia or into Britain, then we could somehow live a more sustainable lifestyle, or the white people could live a more sustainable lifestyle. We even get this a bit from the more mainstream right, figures like Boris Johnson. Right now they're not doing enough. They're just trying to deny that climate change is happening and not doing anything to really deal with the situation. Actually going in the opposite direction. Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about wanting every last drop of North Sea oil from Scotland. They talk about expanding the oil industry, but you can see how quite quickly they could change into saying, at some point they're going to say it's too late, we didn't do anything, now we need to take extreme measures to actually stop the problem. Boris Johnson just before the COP talks in autumn was already talking about that big speech, didn't he, about the fall of the Roman Empire, how he said it was a result of uncontrolled immigration. The empire can no longer control its borders. People came in from the east. We went into a new dark ages. This can all happen again. It's very, very scary stuff. He's talking about huddled masses at the borders. So, we need to talk about climate refugees being welcome. I think it's right that we try to link, socialists before would try to link the issues of environmental crisis with anti-racism. Had environmental slogans, anti-racist marches, for example, and anti-racists as part of the climate movement. Because you can very easily see how people could draw the opposite conclusion. So I think that's where I'll sort of end on really the need for a movement for climate justice that talks about why it's the system that is the problem, and talks about who are the most affected by climate change. Also the people that are the least to blame. Sorry.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you. So we're going to go to a discussion for about 30 minutes. I'm going to ask people to keep their contributions to 3 minutes. When you've got about a minute left, I will tap on my microphone, and if you don't stop talking, I will tell you to stop talking. So it's the first meeting of the conference, so I thought I'd put the bar down for the kind of discipline we're going to see this weekend. So I'm going to get someone to take the microphone around, and if you want to make a contribution, put your hand up. So I'll just... Oh, you got one. Lovely. Sweet. The person in the pink t-shirt, ready pink t-shirt. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The capitalist crimes range from fossil fuel, coal, pesticides, plastic, which all leads to habitat destruction and an increase in extreme disasters from heat waves to violent storms. This year, as been mentioned, we've seen some of the worst heat waves in India and Pakistan, with some areas reaching up to 51 Celsius being described by one local as a scene out of the apocalypse. This described dead cats, dogs and cows in the streets from heat exhaustion. The same that happened in America recently, with 2,000 cattle found dead, and reports of birds falling out of the sky, plummeting to their deaths, and bodies of people passed out on the streets. In the Middle East, 60 Celsius was recorded in temperature last month, which is extinction level heat. Storms have also been recorded, with up to 200 tornadoes recorded in America in March alone this year, and extreme floods in the capital of Turkey and China. All of this is caused by our capitalist system that is leading us into catastrophe. And with the war in Ukraine, we are seeing the increase in fossil fuels and the mass return of coal. The only way we are getting out of this is through mass resistance and struggle, and to get rid of capitalism. You can't reform it or make it green friendly, as there's nothing more than greenwashing by our politicians. And I'm going to finish off by recommending a book on socialism or extinction, the meaning of revolution in a time of ecological crisis, by Martin Anson.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take the comrade at the back with the glasses and the black fleece.
Thanks, that's very interesting. I'm David Carver from Marx 21 in the Spanish state. One of our members was arrested a couple of weeks ago by the anti-terrorist brigade for having participated in a protest by a movement called Scientific Rebellion. In April, they did an excellent direct action at the Spanish Congress. They threw, basically water mixed with beetroots, I think it was, at the wall of the Congress, and made declarations. It was impressive because it was 100 or so scientists, some of them with their white coats and everything, very, very concerned about the state of climate change with the IPCC report, and clearly identifying capitalism as the problem and the need for collective social action. So I think the things that are being said here are obviously correct, but also they're becoming more and more sort of common sense, if you like, that the idea that the solution is to do a bit more recycling and maybe reduce your personal carbon footprint. It's never been the answer, but I think it's so clear now that it's not at all. But in any case, that later on we'll have some bulletins from Marx 21 explaining, and there's an article by this comrade explaining the protest and explaining the arrests. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the front. The comrade in the hat.
Thanks. I want to start firstly by recommending Jeff's book. It's a really interesting book, and it's a refreshing book because he places the question of capitalism at the heart of the climate and ecological crisis. At the same time, he also argues that there is an agency for change, and I think that matters inside the environmental movement because actually, I think millions of people around the world recognise that there's a problem with the society that we live in, but actually don't necessarily see how we can transform things. And what Jeff's book does, from an Australian perspective, which I think is really interesting, as his talk outlined today, is to show how the working class can both be the force for change, but also can develop, through its own struggles, the sort of institutions which will form the basis of a sustainable world. And I think there's a phrase that Jeff used in his introduction there. It's really, really important. He talked about how in Australia, and it's also true of what happened in the Americas, and indeed true with the development of capitalism in Europe, how the arrival of capitalism transforms labour. It transforms labour from a process of interacting in a sustainable way with the natural world into one that is a degrading relationship, where through an exploitative relationship. And that means that capitalism becomes a system that systematically degrades the natural world. It's important because in the final part of his book, Jeff talks about how you could organise a society that once again transforms how people relate to nature through their labour and in a sustainable world. And he does it brilliantly, I think, through the framework of William Morris, the great British socialist, who talked about ecological ideas and about how society could democratically plan production. I think it's a tremendously inspiring vision of how the future could be, how a sustainable world could come out of the revolutionary struggles of working people and transform things. And I think it's something that socialists should take into the movement, that vision not just of how capitalism is the problem, but actually how revolution is the solution.
Thank you. We're going to go to the comrade beside the last comrade that spoke in the blue shirt.
My name's Sarah. I'm an activist in PCS Union. We are the Public and Commercial Services Union. We represent we are civil servants and government departments, and we think a lot about climate change and climate justice, and climate change cannot be reversed. We know that there are huge numbers of people moving across the world because of climate change is destroying their ways of living and their agriculture and reducing water and all the rest of it. And I wanted to say something about my colleagues in the Home Office, because we have, as I'm sure you're all aware, in Britain we have an extremely racist government, and we work for them in our union. But of course that doesn't mean we have to do everything they say. And my colleagues in the Home Office who work on the boats in the Channel have been refusing to push migrants back across the Channel the way they're supposed to. They have been rescuing them instead. People are saying, we don't come to work to drown people. And our colleagues are also refusing to cooperate with the Rwanda plan. And we are not the biggest union, we are not the best organised, but our colleagues have, they are having to sort of organise on a secret basis so that they can't be picked off in their offices. They've got a hashtag which is our Home Office, because they talk about our values and what we want to do, which is we're supposed to be helping people through the asylum system, not keeping them out. And we have to really fight for these arguments, fight racism, because climate justice means we have to stand up for everybody, and that means anybody who's coming across the Channel in a rickety boat, anybody who's trying to get out of wherever they are, fighting for a better life, trying to get somewhere safe. And it also means that organised workers in workplaces, we can do this, even against this extraordinarily vicious government. We can do this, and this is worth fighting for, and this has to be the future of fighting climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the comrade in the blue fleece after that. Thank you.
It's kind of more of a question, because I know Camilla mentioned tensions in North Africa, and I agree that they're not always waiting to burst, but as the climate crisis continues, these tensions will continue to rise, kind of more specifically into like the Nile River Basin conflict, which was actually engineered by the British state. So as socialists, how do we seek to resolve conflicts like this and manage our growing scarce water resources?
Thank you. So yeah, just pass it up to comrade of the blue fleece.
Hi, my name is Barry. I was just slightly concerned, part of Jeff Sparrow's introduction seems to be glorifying primitive communism. But you see, in these societies, there are relations of either patriarchy, but usually matriarchy, and there are social relations of chief to mass. There is also embryonic forms of private property. So, for example, in America, the natives painted their arrows different colours to show who has killed the buffalo. And Marx said that primitive communism contains class society in miniature, it's there in the primitive communism, so you definitely can't go back to that. Really, the sort of Marxist project is about uprooting all social relations from the present and creating something entirely new, but it's not like just a high-tech version of what has previously existed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the comrade in the khaki hat right at the front.
Hello. I was just wondering if you could mention something about the farmers' revolt or resistance.
To speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
Yes. I was just wondering if you could mention something about the farmers' revolt in India recently, because I think it represents something very significant, but also to the idea of the notion of the small, shall we say, almost self-subsistent farmer, and vis-a-vis the working class, what happened to Russia during the revolution and so on, whether there is such thing as reaching out to these two groups. I think in my opinion, I hope I'm not being what you call it. I think to some extent, if I could be apologetic in mentioning that an area subject such as this only draws together middle-class white people, as opposed to, shall we say, a more diverse, ethnically, culturally integrated kind of revolt, and that's what we should aim for as well.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to make a contribution? I haven't. Yes, of course.
While we're taking a tour around the world, I think we should also draw our attention to East Asia, Northeast Asia in particular. And you look at the indigenous people of Inner Asia, the Mongols in particular, who have practiced traditional livestock breeding in a sustainable way. And now with the rise of the commodification and growth of livestock breeding in China, this has led to unsustainable pressures and desertification of the Ordos Plateau. And I think there's kind of a contradiction between sustainable levels of livestock breeding and how much carbon emissions are being produced. At the same time, on one hand, you can't impose a different way of life on indigenous people and their modes of production, but at the same time, this mode of production leads to increased environmental pressures. So I think we should be aware of these contradictions.
Thank you. I'm going to go up to the top of the room, pink t-shirt, and then I will go to the checked shirt at the other side of the room, and then I will.
So, quick question. I heard that, what was it, like over 70% of humanity live in like cities, so like really highly urbanized areas, so like they don't really have a connection to nature, I suppose. So it's like in slightly the same sort of way that the author was talking about in terms of like Aboriginal people. So it's like since most people in humanity are definitely, as you would say, working class, meaning that they they go to work and in exchange they receive a wage. So it's like, why is it that, how do you then convince, most of humanity who live in cities, who don't have any connections to nature, to sort of like convince them that they should care about the state of the world in 30, 40 years, when it's like the thing that's constantly on their mind is like, how am I going to feed my kids tomorrow? How am I going to pay my bills next month? And it's like there's sort of like those immediate issues that they face, when it's like, let alone, thinking about like much more, I don't want to use big words, much more pressing, more global issue in terms of like, the next 100 or so years.
Thank you. So just the check shirt over there, and then I'll also go to the grey shirt in the middle after.
A couple of things. Well, I just wanted to respond to the comrade who talked about Jeff and primitive communism and what his attitude is, because I actually think Jeff made a really important point, which wasn't about romanticising primitive communism, but is a point about the fact that the problem is not human beings or humanity. The problem is capitalism in terms of the destruction of the environment. Obviously, as you can tell, I live in Scotland now, but I born in Australia and lived in Australia. So the debates that come up in the Australian environmental movement are people talk about we need to figure out how to protect the wilderness. We need to get rid of human intervention into nature. The problem is human beings. Specifically in Australia, obviously, there's a lot of discussion around Indigenous people, but those same debates happen everywhere. And one of the important things for left-wing people in Australia is to point out, actually, Aboriginal people didn't just live in this magical wilderness that existed and never interact with nature. Actually, there was a rich history and tradition of Indigenous people shaping the land, clearing land, reorganising land in a way that fit in with the way that their society was set up. The reason why that wasn't destructive in the same way capitalism and the way capitalism interacts with the land and capitalist societies interact with the land is destructive is because that wasn't predicated on making profit, it was predicated on meeting human needs. And we is obviously a far more advanced society, a society, in terms of technological advancements, incredibly different to, in terms of what we expect and how we live and how we organise our lives. If we didn't live in a society, though, that was based on profit, we would still be able to interact with the environment in a way that meant that we would change it, we would clear areas so people could live, we would organise food production in vast and different ways, but that doesn't need to be destructive. It's the profit motive that underlies the way we organise our society that makes it destructive. And I think that's an important point because it's a hopeful point about the potential to, if you actually got rid of capitalism, you could have a society that relies on technology in a way that Indigenous society didn't rely on technology, but that wasn't destructive to society. Just a quick point I want to make, I don't know how much time I have. Last time I was in Australia, unsurprisingly pre-COVID, was at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, when there were the massive bushfires, and I flew back into a haze of smoke, and people, fleeing from areas, people I knew who were trapped in cities facing walls of fire, in towns, and in the main cities there was just plumes of smoke. I feel like one of the things that is really the barrier in some ways to some of the environmental campaigns is not that people don't care, it's the way that capitalism can normalise things that are incredibly destructive, and we've seen that with COVID, the normalisation of mass death. And so I think for socialists and for left-wing people and for people who want to fight against the environment, I think the question for us is how do we push back against that normalisation? How do we provide an opportunity for people who are fucking pissed off about what's going on in the world? How do we provide a political alternative where people feel like they're actually able to express that, to do something about it? And so I think a really key thing is about rebuilding a set of politics that seems like it can do something about it. Because when we live in a world where every political party is committed to net zero and it seems like there's no alternative, there's nothing you can do, I think that's one of the things that's it's a real barrier to actually trying to transform things more than people's just attitudes.
Thank you. In the next section for the grey t-shirt, and then I'm going to go to the black jacket, sort of mid.
Right. Yes, thanks. I just wanted to make a point about what the traditional attitude is towards human beings amongst lots of people in the climate movement about people being consumers of resources rather than producers of resources. And I think that one of the fantastic things about what's been happening with the climate movement recently is the fact that people have made so many links with the RMT and the railway strikes. That's a relationship with the planet that we want to cultivate. We want to get rid of cars, we need better railways, we need more efficient railways, we need more electric railways and so on. And I think that's fantastic that people are making these links. I want to also make a point about primitive communism. I remember reading a book by Jared Diamond, I can't remember the name of it, but he tells this marvellous story about an indigenous society in Borneo where the elderly in society were really venerated, but venerated for a particular materialist reason. And that is because this was a society that was in a volcanic zone, and volcanic eruptions meant that, of course, the whole land got absolutely desecrated and so on. And the importance of the elderly in that society was that they could remember what plants you could eat after the volcanic eruptions that were safe to eat and what weren't, what were poisonous. In other words, the librarians of society, the memory of society. And I think that that's a really important point because, when we talk about the ways in which, society values people, puts a price on people in terms of the relationship to production, in other words, whether they produce profits or not, then I think that what we're talking about is an entirely different attitude to human beings and the different variety and the richness of people's relationship with both our own collective history and the history that we want to fight for, the better future that we all want to fight for, which means a completely different view of what human beings are capable of.
Thank you. I'll take you to the black jacket, or it might be quicker.
Okay, thanks very much. Another Australian, I'm afraid. Thanks very much to Jeff, and thanks very much to Camilla. And yeah, I think I want to start by kind of backing up kind of what Jeff was saying, because I think by looking at Indigenous and kind of more primitive societies, what that gives us is kind of like a longer understanding of human history, and then a kind of a deeper understanding of what humanity is than has just existed in the last 200 years under capitalism, because we're constantly made to feel like this is kind of the natural order of things, isn't it? Like, and so therefore humanity must be a certain way, human nature even, we're competitive or we're selfish. Whereas like by looking at kind of that longer view of history, get an understanding that actually humans have lived in lots of different kinds of societies and related to each other in lots of different ways. And that's something that's constantly missing. And that means that human nature isn't determined, right? It's actually that's shaped by the kind of society that we live in. Our relationships are shaped by the kind of society that we live in. And because we live in a society that is fundamentally determined by competition and exploitation, a lot of those, it shapes human nature in a negative way, and because we live in a society that's based on the destruction of the environment, we're kind of taught that human beings are innately destructive and there's nothing we can do about it, when that isn't really true. And so I think it's very useful to think about that longer view of history, and I think that's what Marxism actually gives us, that ability to look at, start from the labor process and think about the kind of relationships that form out of that. And I think what marks out capitalism as being unique is that uniquely destructive relationship, but it's also the fact that it's been able to dominate and grow around the world in such an unparalleled way in human history. But in doing that, it's also created, its greatest alternative. It's created a working class that is universal, a working class that can communicate with each other around the world and start to think about the alternative. That relationship of exploitation that runs down the center has actually created the greatest possibility of destroying that system that we live under. And I think, especially to come back on what Alder was saying, I think that climate change is one of a set of interlocking existential crises that capitalism is facing at the moment. If we think about the walls of fire that we saw.
Now, please.
Yeah, sorry. Well, basically what I wanted to say is that I think that climate change is just one of several crises, and that face working class people, whether that's economic crises, pandemic, and people are starting to draw those links. And I think we need to think about that kind of scale of change, a complete system change to face up to the level of crisis that we're facing. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the last two contributions now. So I'm going to go to the person in the purple shirt, and then I'm going to go to the person at the back in black. Sorry to everyone. Got to keep on time,
Yeah, thanks to the two speakers and thanks to everyone else that's made a contribution. It's great to be back here. I think everyone would agree. I want to quickly mention the first Australian comrade that mentioned the Australian fires, and just capitalism is so bad. The right-wing Australian Prime Minister still agreed to do the Sydney firework display when half the country was burnt. And I think that
just make sure you hold it close to your mouth.
That's right off. Oh, it's on now. Yeah, no, but as I said, the Australian Prime Minister still agreed to burn lots of fireworks, even though half the country is burning. I think that's just a symbol of how bad the situation really is. And I think the situation is really urgent. I mean, we've got 8 countries that are going to be under the water in the next 10 years. Places like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Palau, Nauru. You've had lots of places that have already had mass flooding. Indonesia even moved its capital from Jakarta to a different place just because it's flooding. What that means is a city of 30 million people, working class people. It means if you're working class, you're going to be there and suffer. If you're rich in Jakarta, you can flee. You've got the money to flee. So again, it's a class issue. And you've got poor places like Mozambique that have seen flooding as well. And I think it's just the urgency of this. People are going to die because of this. People are dying because of this. And I think there's got to be a saying, we don't have all the time in the world. And what I would say is we need a revolution now. And to get a revolution, we need to build a mass party. And if you're not a member of SWP, please join us and win this war against these capitalist bastards.
Thank you. We're going to go to the back of the room.
Is it on?
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up the fact that when we talk about climate change, the first people who will really feel its effect will be people of color, like the countries that are going to be underwater. Majority, like countries full of people of color, and I think it's important to realize that obviously climate change is not going to hit a country and say, oh, there's white people here, they'll be fine, let me just leave. But it's like these countries are not prepared enough to deal with the issues coming their way, because I mean, look at Bangladesh a couple of days ago. I think it was Sylhet that's completely underwater, well, not completely, but drowning. And there's people there dying, and they don't have the resources to deal with this. No one's going to give them the resources to deal with this. I think with the West, it's very easy to, we need to send out, all of these sort of things. But when you have societies like that, where the government itself is just complete bullshit. Not saying that ours isn't, but when you have a country like that, where again India, Pakistan, all of them, where the government is allowing the workers to be exploited by the British, by the American, big companies that come in and buy people's labor, like the sweatshop in Pakistan that just exploded one day. When you have countries like that are being constantly exploited, we cannot expect them to survive these floods, these earthquakes, these eruptions. And it's just, it's piss-taking, basically. I think we need to, really understand that it's a crime that affects the most impoverished, even in our society. Because you see, like in high water zones or whatever, flooding, you see mostly people of color living there. You see where they're putting huge nuclear power stations, like there's powerhouses that are releasing tons of pollution. It's always in places where there is a majority of black and brown people. I think, we just really got to see that this racist bullshit, I mean, it's going to affect everyone, right? But it's going to affect people of color first. And, it's fuck. So,
Just wanted to respond to the comrade in the pink shirt who brought up the issue of what do we do practically to deal with these issues, because they are, like someone else mentioned, very complex interlocking issues, and it's very difficult to find any sort of solution. I think one really big thing that we could do that would remove the sort of pressure that capitalism puts us all under is the implementation of a universal basic income. That's been tested several times recently. I think that implementation in modern society would vastly change the response that the mass, people en masse have to social issues in general. So I think that's a really big, really important issue that we could take that would be the first step in solving a lot of these issues, including the climate crisis. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop contributions now, and we're going to first go back to Jeff for about 7.5 minutes. So I hope you can hear the 7.5 minutes, Jeff.
Look, there's a lot to cover there. Thanks so much for the discussion. Even though I couldn't hear very much of it, it sounded like it was very interesting. I did get the impression that someone was taking me to task about primitive communism. All I would say about that, I'm not suggesting that that we should return to pre-1788 Australia. I'm not even sure what that would mean. My attitude to that, I think, is quite similar to the way that 19th century Marxists talked about feudalism, a society with all kinds of problems, but interesting because it manifested a different attitude towards labour and to nature that we can learn from today. There was someone else who was talking about the relationship between the working class and nature, and the way that working class people are often quite alienated from nature. I have to confess, that for most of my life, when I was young, which was a long time ago, I was not the slightest bit interested in the environment. I thought it was the most tedious thing, and the only people who talked about it were hippies. But it's a different world today. I'm sorry to keep banging on about Australia, but the last 3 years in Australia, what has happened? We have had catastrophic bushfires, we have had a COVID pandemic, and we have had massive floods. All of those things, all three of those things, are connected to the environmental crisis, of which climate change is merely one manifestation. And all of those things have overwhelmingly affected working class people far more than anyone else. The people who are burnt out, the people who are flooded, the people who lost their jobs or suffered or died during COVID were overwhelmingly working class people. Or I mentioned previously the two Amazons. I'm sure that you'll be talking at your conference about the heroic organising efforts in the Amazon factories. A couple of the issues that have been motivating organisers there, one is the massively high levels of COVID in Amazon, and another is that as the planet heats, those warehouses are so hot that people are collapsing. There's stories of like ambulances just being parked outside to carry people off, and that's been a massive driver in people to organise. So you can see that that the environmental crisis is now pressing down on working class people where they live and where they work. One of the ways to think about it, I think, is that climate is a crisis intensifier. It makes every kind of oppression worse than it otherwise would be. And it's very, very difficult, I think, going forward to imagine any kind of political crisis now that won't be some way related to the environment and the environmental collapse. You only have to think of the war in Ukraine and its relationship to fossil fuels. I am just now not entirely sure whether you can hear anything that I'm saying. Can you? Okay, great. I just thought I was just gesticulating. All right, I'll just finish there. Thanks so much for the invitation, and yeah, it's been a pleasure to speak to your conference.
Thanks, Jeff, and apologies for the sound. So obviously something we need to think about moving forward. But I'm going to go to Camilla for the same amount of, well, you don't have to do this. You can do a bit longer than Jeff did, but yeah, for about 7.5 minutes, that would be great.
Great. So there was lots of really interesting points. There was, firstly, absolutely right to talk about how it's going to be people of colour who are most affected by these multiple crises, and it already is people in the global south who are most affected, and also the poorest people in the global north, often also Black and Asian people who are the most vulnerable. And I think it's it's right to look at the legacy of imperialism, colonialism, has made parts of the world more vulnerable, isn't it? Just look at Afghanistan. Look at what happens when you get an earthquake in Afghanistan, and no one seems to even want to do anything to help the situation, even though that's a whole situation that the West has created, that our intervention has led to. It's one reason why governments in our countries, Britain and Australia and elsewhere, don't seem to want to do too much about this, is that they think that it'd be people in other parts of the world, somewhere very far away, who are most affected by the crisis, and that's just due to racism, in my opinion. Someone talked about majority of people do work globally now live in cities. That's true. I don't know if it's 70%. It's definitely majority now. It's went over 50% a few years ago. I don't quite agree that means you don't have a connection to nature. I think part of what we're trying to the analysis what we're trying to kind of put forward here is that all human beings and all species relate to nature through the kind of labour that we do. So we don't want to just have this idea that nature is something that you get in the wilderness, where the indigenous people might be in some kind of colonial imagination, and that cities aren't anything to do with nature. We all relate to nature. We relate to nature in some more obvious ways as well. Lots of people really enjoy gardening and spending time in parks and things like that, and even having house plants, even if they can't spend time out in the park. But more generally, I think we all relate to nature. The people, RMT strikers in the centre of London, shutting down trains, trying to argue for more investment in their industry, and as people have said, it's also an environmental issue. People from Extinction Rebellion are quite right to go down and show support. They're also playing their part in thinking about how we're going to shape nature and what kind of world we want to live in their own kind of in their own small way, by talking about more investment in public transport. There's so struggles in cities, also struggles about how we relate to nature as well. People do have pressing concerns, but I think pressing concerns can also be about about the environment as well. Look at people's struggles to pay their fuel bills at the moment. That is also an environmental issue. That is about companies like BP and Shell, who are making billions of pounds in this country profit every quarter, that aren't paying tax, that are being given money by the government. They're paying negative tax in many cases. The same massive corporations that are putting their need to extract more and more fossil fuels ahead of the future of the planet. People that are worried about their fuel bills and people who are worried about the planet are should be the same people. We have the same enemies, and I think often the best people in the environmental movement do get this as well. They do see that it's not a contradiction between being able to heat our homes and being able to care about the future of the planet. Actually we want a huge amount of investment in home insulation, don't we, which would also create millions of jobs and would be something that trade unions and working class people more generally could push for in this country. Lots, like I say, I think someone talked about how sometimes environmentalism has seen people as consumers rather than looked at people's role as producers. I probably won't have time to go into the whole issue of consumption in any huge detail, but I think Jeff's book is really good on it when it talks about this issue of, do people just naturally want more cars? Is that the problem, that people are greedy and they just want to drive, or they'll just want to buy more and more plastic bags and use them? Actually, when cars were first introduced, it actually talks about how people resisted the introduction of the car. I find that really interesting. It wasn't necessarily about the environment, it was more about safety, actually, because cars were killing kids and kids wanted to be able to play out on the streets and not risk getting run over. But there was actually there was resistance to the introduction of the car. People didn't just naturally decide that they really wanted and needed this thing to be able to live their lives. Water resources. You could go into some detail about the conflict in the Nile. That's kind of states in conflict over who's going to control the water resources, as far as I can tell. I think a kind of example that I know a little bit more about, I guess, is the Syrian revolution. It's sometimes seen as a kind of revolt over water, and I think there is kind of some truth in the idea that there was a huge drought in Syria a few years before the revolution broke out. People migrated into cities. People were very angry at the government about how they mismanaged the drought. I don't think you can explain conflict purely in terms of drought and conflict over water supplies. I think if you want to understand something like that, you need to look at why people were so angry at the government, why they rose up, and also what was the reaction on the part of the Syrian state that turned that uprising, that revolution, in my view, into this kind of horrendous civil war that has led to many deaths and huge amounts of migration. That's different states and different huge superpowers like the US and Russia involving themselves in that conflict and taking different sides. So I think you can understand how water plays some role in it, but it's not the only factor. Great. I'd also think that people, when people face scarcity of things like water, I mean, there is good evidence to show that actually they don't just kind of break out into conflict and fight over it, that people do find ways of trying to share resources once they get scarce. Actually, people cooperate more in conditions of scarcity, according to a lot of the research. And I think these are the parts of the world where we're going to see more revolts breaking out around the world. I don't think that the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa are over. I think they're ongoing. We'll talk more about this over the weekend with people who are much more expert than I am. But I think it's not just going to be white middle class people that revolt over the environment. It's going to be very, very far from it, I think. Just finally, excellent that people in the Spanish state are taking direct action over climate change, but also I think the example of the PCS members was truly inspiring, that people actually organising in their workplace around what we do about this horrendous Rwanda plan from our government. I don't think it's happened by chance that people in those workplaces are organising and trying and starting to argue about our values and about controlling the workplace. I think probably those arguments have come up because there are socialists organising in those workplaces. I think that's a an example of why we need many more socialists, organised and active in their workplaces and in the movement.